Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. And joining me today again is Victor Kinzer. And we're going to talk about the organization, or lack thereof, of the Disparate Alliance. We previously talked about the technocracy, where we got 900 total pages seemingly on how they operate. So we thought, hey, you know who we have no information on? The Disparates. You know who we should talk about? The Disparates. But that conversation was so much fun that we're just full of that wide-eyed can-do spirit that we're going to make it work. Victor, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I've been thinking a lot about this, and it's going to be a little more speculative. We're going to make some stuff up, I'm sure.
Yes. Future Strange and Uncertain, the Disparate Alliance may be the title of this episode. I also like that we're boldly choosing to do this before the Disparate Alliance book comes out. We're like, well, there's a book that could explain all of it. Should we wait until it comes out? Nah. I got a free Friday. Let's do this. So before we can really talk about the Disparates, I think we need to start by talking about the crafts. And craft, capital C, is a term that I think was first introduced with second edition. The first reference we got kind of to what we would later call is a craft is the Book of Shadows, where they refer to the Ali Batini as a lost tradition. And we get kind of a write-up on the role they fulfilled. We get a little bit of information that indicates that they were replaced by the virtual adepts and they may still be out there. They have this organization of being tightly bound into little camps called Kanakas that have a ruling council of sheikhs and closely knit cells. This is the 90s, so the idea of being organized by like a terrorist cell wasn't really there, but it's like it works like a covert intelligence agency. And we got kind of vague ideas of what they do. I did not realize the Book of Shadows had such an explosion of all the terms that we had. Were like, this sounds vaguely Arabic, which I kind of prefer. I like the slightly wrong terms. That way no one can correct you. Like, what does Kavadi mean? I don't know. Like, what language is it from? Sure. Do you have any thoughts on like that first little burst of the Ali Batin before we get into their kind of formal introduction as a thing in second edition?
Yeah. So my thought on that first burst of the Ali Batin goes back to some interviews I've heard with Satiros about like the first step of Mage, where they wrote Mage, it was basically done, and they looked at it and they went, we cannot sell this. I don't know why they said that. Apparently there are one or two copies of that original draft out there somewhere. I've not seen them, but they decided this is not workable for whatever reason, and they like furiously rewrote the whole thing in a few weeks before it had to like go to layout. And so it was rushed. If you read, I love first edition Mage for just the sheer campy like madness of it, but it shows a little bit. And, you know, Sater wasn't involved in any of that. You know, then he got signed on. And I feel like looking at when the books came out, Book of Shadows was his first attempt to like finish the thought. And I think that's why we get the Ali Batin. And, you know, the first thought was kind of, okay, we've got these 9 traditions. We've got like a one sentence hook that maybe there are other traditions, but we don't really know thematically what we do with them. And okay, well, what about cultural representations of belief in magic that don't quite fit into these 9 traditions? Let's actually make groups for that. And so I think the fact that our first group is culturally specific, tied to an actual mystic tradition, in thematically at least, Sufism, I think that really created the template. Terms and whatnot aside, that was a template that was used over and over and over again to create other crafts. So I think it is a good place to go back and start.
Yeah, and in second edition core, we get a section on the crafts, and crafts is put in quotes here, and it is listed as a catch-all label for mystical societies unaligned with the Council of the Nine. The so-called crafts, who almost never answer to that title, make little distinction between the hedge wizard and the awakened one. To them, labels are a waste of time. Crafts are pockets of mages united along a single cultural paradigm, such as Caribbean voodoo, European alchemy, Gothic punk sorcery. More concerned with the practical application of magic than metaphysics, such mages will never be heard discussing ascension or the subjective nature of reality. Thus, their approach to magic is termed craft rather than art by outsiders. Each craft specializes in a certain form of magic, either through choice or inheritability. While less flexible than tradition mages, they can be quite proficient in their respective concentrations. I like this for a couple of reasons, because it introduces the art versus craft dichotomy, which I think is kind of a useful one, where to me craft is generally a conversation between the tool user and the tool to accomplish a goal, where art to me is generally a conversation between the artist and the audience. I am not in any way saying one is as more important than the other, but to me, craft tends to be more useful and art tends to be a little bit more expressive, and things always kind of exist along this kind of spectrum. I like the fact that it highlights the fact that craft is not their term in the same way that no orphan would call themselves kind of an orphan. And it fits with the idea that as we transition from first edition to second edition, rather than traditions being this weird secret societies, they may be tied to human traditions. It just so happens that these 9 have banded together for various historical reasons, but there's a bunch of other ones out there. Also, it indicates that they don't care about ascension, that is just not something that fits into their worldview, which could almost be the defining features of the traditions or the subjective nature of reality. I also didn't realize that this is when the idea that there are groups that don't differentiate between hedge and awakened magic first comes up. What do you think about this like 2e core introduction of crafts as a term?
I really, really like it. The thing I like the most about it is you won't hear them talking about subjective reality, because one of the things that I see a lot of new players, and honestly, even intermediate players of Mage, struggle with is but of course everyone's in on the joke. Like, they mix up the way we as players think about spheres and magic and presenting things and the way their characters probably do. And there are reasons for that. Like, you look at the 9 traditions, and for all of the word count devoted to, I believe in this so strongly, it becomes real. My dream speaker is also doing a combined working with this etherite that's going to be distributed across the world by, the virtual adept in our cell. And you have to be a little in on the joke. And then the whole oh, no, technocrats don't believe any of this, but you hunt deviants. And those deviants are mages. You have to be a little in on the joke. And that's hard to reconcile. I actually think it's a bit of a break in the logic of the canon. It's not unreconcilable, but it takes some work. And so I like the idea of starting out with an orphan or craft members where they're just not in on the joke. You don't have to pretend. Just don't have them be in on the joke. And when they're working with each other, that's like a major strain for them cognitively. I think that's an easier place to start with Mage. So I like that they made a space for those characters. And I like all of the other things. I like the not separating between hedges and awakened, because again, if you're not in on the joke, if you haven't gone through the whole postmodern exercise of subsuming everyone else's, paradigm that you work with just a little bit, then it's just, hey, I'm a little more dynamic. I'm a little more creative than this other person, but they're still doing the same things I am. Whether or not that's true in the system, that can make sense in your head. And I think that's such an interesting space to carve out and make room for in Mage.
Yeah. I guess the only thing I wish is that they had showed at some point that you could be specialized in magic. I think of the Solificati and what they do. And in a weird way, that is the one case to me where no, hedge magicians are actually quite good at this compared to mages. Or you have the Hemka Sobek who only have 5 spheres or 4 spheres. What is the benefit of losing that, if anything? And one view is these are intended to be NPCs. Your characters are never going to do it. You just need to provide enough detail for that. But as more time marches forward, we never really get a way to say, hey, I'm good at this, except for maybe you have resonance that works with it and there's a disproportionate way to do it, or it's a tight-knit community so it's easy to get the instruction you seek. That's what we get in the core. We also, at this point, have gotten mentions of the Solificati having been a group, which we don't get details for a bit. The next book that kind of gives us more information is World of Darkness Outcasts, which gives us a bunch of information on the Hollowers and presents them as kind of a mix of romantic and gutter punk mages. Not until revised do we get what I refer to as the proper trichotomy between gutter mages, romantics, and postmoderns that kind of form the core beliefs of that group, or at least the pillars of potential belief within this group. We get a bunch of rotes, some information on how they work. We also get the idea, we get a break from the idea in 1E that Hollowers and orphans were kind of the same thing. We get clear separation between those two, that there is this formal group. We also get rid of kind of the 1E notion that in recent history there has been this weird uptick in awakenings, and we're not quite sure what to make of that. But the real explosion comes in 1996, after World of Darkness Outcast comes out in 95, that is the Book of Crafts, and this includes a lot. And these are things that had been vaguely referenced to before, but we get a bunch of groups, and we get a bunch of information on how they themselves are organized. We get the Bata'a, which is the Afro-Caribbean magical families that indicates that they look over 100 million people and they have 300 to 400 awakened mages. That is a huge number to me, that they have the 7 Rengi that each leads their own family network, kind of, that each of those local cells is headed by a male-female pair of some type, that they can be very violent between them. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the Children of Knowledge, where there's like, yeah, there's 4. We don't have ranks because we know everyone's name. Like, your rank is Jim because there's only 5 of us. We get the Hemka Sobek, where it's suggested that there are 12 tribes, of which 2 have over 400 participants, with 100 priests that may be awakened or not. You have the Sunu, which are kind of the teeth of Sobek, and they're the ones that get the nutty rotes, where you can make it feel like someone is falling forever after Sobek visits you in your dream to indicate you have been judged wanting, and if you fail, you will be consumed. I like the commentary on their division, because it's like, we're all but dust besides Sobek. Who cares about rank? I'm like, well, that's a way of doing it. That would be like joining the Nefandi, like some group of nihilists, and being like, yeah, we are all but specks in the eyes of the cosmos, so we have a pretty flat org chart here. Like, the Hollowers are arranged into cliques. The Kopoloe have more roles than a hierarchy, and there may be only 24 awakened ones. We don't get a lot of information about the Sisters of Hippolyta. We get that there are 3 conclaves depending around the world. All people have membership in one. They have their little councils of 7. We get the highly hierarchical Templars with a Grand Master in charge, 70 awakened members. The Grand Master has great power. Their word is law. They're backed up by the 9 Seneschals. We get the Wu Kang, which have a wacky organization, and I absolutely love them, where they're in little cabals of 5 with 3 aunts, 1 mother, and 1 child. And then we get the Wulong, where there's about 100 in total, with the Phoenix, Tiger Lord, Emperor, and 8 other lords that kind of oversee it. I like here that it sometimes presents groups as highly hierarchical, but you're like, there's 30 of you. How much hierarchy can you have? So what did you take from like what we got from the Book of Crafts?
Yeah, so the Book of Crafts is definitely the book that I spent the most time with, and I loved the diversity of organization. I'll be honest, I kind of wish they hadn't listed how many of each group there were. That's something that I've always kind of struggled with a little bit in the World of Darkness, is don't tell me how many of any given supernatural there are, because honestly, I don't want to have those arguments with my players. I want to put the number of NPCs in a game that create a set of dynamic social interactions that like make the game worthwhile. And truth be told, especially for Mage, that requires too many mages to make sense at the population numbers. Like, just too many. Like, if you have a small city and you have enough mages in that city to make a dynamic mage-focused story, you have too many mages in that city for the whole town to not blow up randomly. And that's just the way the game works.
This reminds me, a friend of mine, on the first time they tried to make chocolate chip cookies, was like, well, this recipe doesn't seem like it has enough chocolate morsels in it. And at a critical point, you need dough to hold the chocolate chips together. And that, to me, and we just got these blobs of burnt chocolate with little bits of dough crying out for the sweet release of death. And that, to me, are those games when you're like, we are in Boise, Idaho. There are 75 mages here. You're like, okay.
I've never done that. I've done like 12 mages in Chicago who are, and it's not that there are seven mages. It's that there are 7 mages that are significant enough to be part of your story, which means there are 3 times as many one Arete schlubs walking around, still making a substantial, like, disruptive difference in the city.
So you bring that up more so than anything. I wish M20 had a book of schlubs, because there is this huge implied mass of mages that never really amount to anything, and their Arete probably taps out at 2. And it's like, oh, mages are the apex of human potential, except for Carl. We really don't know what happened with Carl.
At the same time, Carl, in a room full of normal mortals, even like normal mortal multi-millionaire business leaders, Carl's going to own that room.
Which is terrifying. It's like when dealing with elementary school kids and like a 4th grader towers over a 3rd grader. Yep. You're like, you're 8 months older than him. There should not be this kind of power disparity, but here we are.
Yeah. Here we are.
Yep.
Yeah, to get back to the disparate, or to get back to the crafts at this point, they're not yet disparates. I loved the diversity of organization. I also loved that this kind of got us away from the this is what the crafts are. As much as those couple of sentences kind of introduced in late 1E, early second edition, I like that that was clearly there to kind of break away from the default PC mode, and that was needed. You need that first step. At the same time, that's that is a terrible way to describe everyone that's not in a tradition. Like that's just no 5 sentences are going to do that. And so I loved seeing these like very communal organizations among the Sisters of Hippolyta. Again, we didn't get much detail, but there was like a sense that it was egalitarian and sort of communal. And then these very, very structured hierarchies with the Wulong and the different things in between. And I liked it because when I read through it, it all seemed playable. For me, the quality of a gaming text is always like reading this. Would this help me create a scene or an NPC interaction? And in every case, I thought, yes, this absolutely would. Like if I wanted there to be a member of this organization, this is going to tell me what are their preconceptions, how are they going to treat other people. If I want to be ridiculous and have like 4 Coppola in my story, despite this very small number in this book, double digits awakened in the whole world. Okay. I could do that. I know what that's going to look like, even if I've sort of taken them out of their indigenous setting and, they've traveled for whatever reason in my story. I liked that. I liked how much diversity it added, because before that, we actually have almost nothing on the technocracy at this point. I mean, we have some convention books, but we don't have guide to the technocracy yet. So it's all very like group paradigm. If I'm running an NPC as a villain, what are the things they can do focused? It's not organizationally focused. At least most of those early convention books aren't. And we've got the traditions, but honestly, especially the early stuff was very light on what's the governance like. That was hard to find until much later in the line. So I almost felt like at this exact moment when this book came out, we had a more focused vision of how would things be organized among these disparate groups than sometimes we even would have around like what's an average tradition chantry look like politically. I don't know that I could have answered that question all that accurately when Book of the Crafts came out.
Yeah, we got Horizon Stronghold of Hope as the book release before that, and that was the first time where it's like, ta-da, organization. And we didn't really get information on how the technocracy worked until Book of Mirrors, which had a kind of a section on that organization. And you mentioned diversity. When I think diversity, I think revised. But in this case, it's a weird thing where they're like, hey, the crafts are gone. The crafts are all the other groups. In other news, here's a whole bunch of other groups. So after we have the fall of Duizatep and the events of the Ascension Warrior plotline, the technocracy is like, oh, these folks are in disarray. Let's mess them up. They reinstitute a great kind of purge. Out of these ashes, the Templars join the chorus. The Wulong joins the Akashiyana and some of the Hermetics. Several of them disappear. The Hemka Sobek are all gone. They're just gone. The Wukang are set up to be kind of at the edge of things as 1999 approaches and their 3 millennia of service ends. But then we get 2 books. We get Dragons of the East, where it's like, well, the crafts are gone. In unrelated news, here's a bunch of groups we've never heard about before. The Go Kamisori Gama, the Tok Fan, the Tai Hoi Li, the Sons of Tengri, and way more information about the Wukang and Wulong. We also then get Lost Paths, who are like, well, the crafts are gone, but here are the Taftani, which is just a fun book. I always appreciate that, even if I question some of the choices. But then we get this explosion of other groups. And then at the same time, throughout Revised, especially in Lore of the Traditions, we get all of these cross-tradition groups that suggest that they are primarily around practice. They may be religiously organized, they may be regionally organized, less so than maybe a political organization, suggesting mages have a tradition that represents their political views, but also something else they go to represent something closer to their sleeper views. What did you feel about Revised?
Oh, man, you didn't even touch on my favorite little extra groups bit of Revised, which was not only Dead Magic 1, but Dead Magic 2. Oh, yes. Yeah, the crafts are all gone. Here's a huge swath of crafts that we've intentionally kind of made unplayable. Oh, and they don't really exist. Enjoy. the most useful word count ever written. I am not a fan of what happened with the extra groups in Revised. I do like Lost Paths. I think the Toftani are loads of fun. I did not like most of these groups are subsumed into each other. I know why they did it. I know why they absorbed a bunch of the crafts into the traditions. And it was because Mage was becoming very unapproachable for new players. I mean, I've heard lots of new players say this about M20, which is arguably a more comprehensible package than late second edition was. And it's just a lot. And so I get why they did it. But then, like you point out, then they introduced all these extra groups after they did that. And I was left just wondering, like, wait, the Templars and the Choristers, let's talk about how much they hate each other and why they hate each other. Like, this is not we just have political differences, but actually we sort of believe the same thing. No, they are diametrically opposed paradigms that happen to share an aesthetic of monotheism. That's what they are. And similarly with a lot of the groups that got pulled into, the Order of Hermes, i.e. 80% of them, it was just like, I'm sorry, calling it a hermetic house, but not actually like doing anything to make it hermetic doesn't do anybody any favors, because the Children of Knowledge ceased to be meaningfully hermetic a long time ago. They are not the Solificati anymore. So it felt to me like there were some structured gaming systematic decisions and goals that were put on a whiteboard and applied to like 2 books that were then forgotten about. And it just, if they had at least committed to those goals for the whole edition, I would have been like, okay, we lost some of this like complexity that I like, but here are some concrete like improvements in accessibility and onboarding and people picking up the game. We didn't actually get any of that because they didn't stick with it. So I'm happy that all of that lives in the past.
Yeah, we almost got this weird hierarchy where at the top of organizations, you have the technocracy, which has political goals that are unified and paradigms that are unified. Then below that, you had the traditions in Revised, which were primarily political groups, seemingly. And then to support the fact that there are also belief structures that they wanted to have represented by groups, we have Dead Magic 1 and Dead Magic 2 that introduce the, for lack of a better term, I'll call it the folk beliefs that could exist in a game, which was previously the territory that kind of the crafts had. And my favorite thing about Dead Magic 1 is you're like, oh yeah, here's a big cool book of interesting beliefs. Nobody practices them anymore, and if any of it enters your game, you're grave robbing. And then you had Dead Magic 2, which is like, these are traditions that don't exist anymore. Here are the millions of people that believe in them. I'm like, at what point is this dead? I kind of question your definition here. But it did give me some of my favorite magic in all of Mage the Ascension. One is, Fulminamancy, which is predicting the future with lightning, which I think we need more of. The other one was the Leap of Wisdom, the weird English rote where you can mega jump but get smarter in the process. I think we need more and more of that. You do that 15 or 16 times and you're ready to take on the hyper-intelligent dolphins that lead the progenitors. And that puts us in a real weird place at the end of Revised, where M20 comes around. You have the traditions, which are like, ta-da, New Horizon Council. We're not going to tell you where it came from, but it's in Zurich. Where they're like, yes, it was a fake out in Revised, but a fake out so deep that it worked and they actually did it. No longer making it a fake out. Who cares? A bunch of the crafts change. The Children of Knowledge are much more interested in, like, let's say, other forms of knowledge. Their likelihood of creating a gold from lead is much lower than their willingness to be your like LSD provider. Toftani are now these interesting rockers. We get the introduction of the Nagoma, which I don't think we had gotten before. We had a house Nagoma, and I think that was about it. We get some crafts that are just gone, and I get it. Haven't gotten the 21st century version of the Wu Kang as much as I would be kind of curious about what that is. And then we get the idea of the Disparate Alliance, which is the Nagoma, the Batini, the Bata'a, the Hollowers, and the Children of Knowledge create a secret alliance. They are bent on destroying the technocracy, but you get the idea that it may be due to them wanting to believing that the technocracy has been a victim of Nephandic infiltration. And then later, that is kind of directly stated that they think the real enemy in the Ascension conflict are the Nephandi. And I think this is cool and interesting. But the first thing I think of is the demographics of this, where you have the Batini. 15 million Sufi Islamic practitioners running around out there. I don't know how many Goths there are, but let's be generous and say that there are 15 million Goths running around in the Western world. We have the Children of Knowledge. Again, they're up to 5. Gary got his shit together and got one of his friends. That's 25% growth, Victor, from Revised, going from 4 to 5. You've got the Bata'a, which are indicated as covering roughly 100 million sleepers. And then you have Ngoma, which is, if we take all of sub-Saharan Africa, is like, what, 700 million people? There's a slight disparity of that. Kind of like if you run the numbers based on demographics, you're like, no, and Asia should be most of the world's mages because 50% of humanity lives within 300 miles of Kuala Lumpur or something like that. So what did you think kind of the genesis of the Disparates, of this alliance that we don't quite have details on yet?
So I feel like the Disparate Alliance is actually accomplishing what the reconciliation at the start of Revised was attempting. And, similarly in goal, you streamline and simplify a game as big and messy as Mage, is you're going to lose some stuff. I think we lost some stuff, but I think it was worth it. It's so much easier to pitch to a new player, hey, there's this group, and here's why they're roughly organized. But if you want to be really, really independent and only have some rough allies, this is your option. If you want really strong coordination, but still be the underdog, here's your organization. And if you want to be an authoritarian, tech douchebag, here's your organization. Those are elevator pitches I can make. And starting there and getting that in your head and then diving into the diversity of the groups, it's just a lot easier. I find, to digress a little bit, I saw this really interesting piece once on the paralysis of choice and how if you give people totally open-ended white canvas choice, they will seize up and they can't do anything. They cannot make choices.
Yeah, the tyranny of the blank page.
Yeah, the tyranny of the blank page. And car companies had put together an ordering mechanism where through software, they narrowed it down and they went, all right, here are our 4 car types. Pick your car type. Okay, you've picked your car type. Here are our colors. Pick your color. Here are the, interior upholstery options. Pick your interior upholstery. And people can do that. They can do that all day long. They can't just look at a blank page. And I feel like a lot of the crafts were sort of in that, there are 75 different groups. Which one do you want to play? I don't know. Here are 3 rough paradigms. Which one sounds appealing? Okay, now, do you want to be sort of spiritual? Do you want to be hierarchical? Okay, so here are the groups that kind of fit that. There's a little bit of this choice tiering that the storyteller needs to help you through, but they only need to help you through a little bit of it. And I feel like the Disparates gave us that. I think the pure independence, the pure I am Kopaloe, and that's my whole identity, full stop. And what does that mean? And what is that story? We gave a little bit of that up. Now I'm wrapped up in this fight against the fallen that used to belong to the Batini. And why do I care so much? I mean, there's some extra downsides, but I feel like those downsides only really matter if you really get in and pick all the Mage canon apart. And let's be honest, most players don't care and they shouldn't have to. So I think on the whole, it's a win.
I frequently am thrown off by people who get rid of the traditions, thinking that they are too complicated, where it's oh, you have this bunch of groups to know. I'm like, I don't know. It's real useful to have something that kind of looks like character classes. And there's certainly a curve to it. And I'm perfectly fine with the starting player being oh, I want to play a shaman, so I'm going to be a dream speaker. Sure, that's fine. It's when that persists after a while where I'm still let's broaden this up a little bit. And to correct myself earlier, sub-Saharan Africa is about 1.1 billion people. So 10 to 1 Ngoma versus everyone else. So basically it's the Ngoma and friends, which I am fine with. I would be glad to see that as a book. And in the core, we don't get a bunch of material. They talk about the other potential groups that have joined, and we get information on the Kopaloe, the Sisters of Hippolyta, the Taftani, the Templar Knights, and so on, that are participating in this Disparate Alliance, but we just don't get anything on organization until we get to Book of Secrets. And it kind of outlines two things. One, that the Disparates have protectorates, that they oversee mortal communities. And I like this as an organizing principle, that the fundamental, what defines a craft is it is a group fundamentally concerned with the protection of a specific sleeper community. And I'm just going to rattle off the list because it's a short one. Ali Batin, Sufi Muslims, the Bata'a, African Americans who embrace voodoo creeds, voodoo with scare quotes around it, Children of Knowledge, alchemists, all 8 of them because we're including sorcerers now, Hollowers, artists, Kopaloi, Polynesians, the Ngoma, African children and their families. That comes out to about 800 by my back-of-the-envelope calculations. Sisters of Hippolyta, female survivors of trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual violence, the Taftani, Zoroastrians, and the Yazidi. That was a big plot twist for me, where it's like, yep, the Yazidis now. I'm like, oh, wow, that's interesting. The Taftani are now mostly Yazidi in terms of mortal population, which to me is very different from the weird, not quite Zoroastrianism that we had gotten previously, which, again, I am fine with. Templar Knights, Christians, specifically in the Holy Land, and the Wulong, Chinese immigrants to other regions, which by my math was about 80 million people. Do you like the idea of this, of kind of one of their principles being, we have a mortal or sleeper community that we want to protect, and do they make sense to you?
I love this idea. I love this idea because one of the things I've always struggled with Mage, I don't think this is reflective of what's good or bad with Mage. I think this is a bias I have. I've always struggled with street level games. This has to do with my own background. Like I have a hard time like thinking about what would someone who could literally reform reality do at the street level. This makes sense to me. This is like the broad societal version of the touchstone in V5. And I think that it gives you this immediate thing to latch onto, to something's happening in your community, something's happening to someone you care about, an immediate reason for you to care about random NPC that isn't like big and powerful and politically influential, which, let's be honest, most players, gravitate towards the big, powerful, like shiny plot piece, but really the World of Darkness kind of gets at its best and juiciest when you just care about things because humanity. I feel like this facilitates those stories. I almost wish there was more fluff out there, fluff being, flavor word count, on the actual stories that emerge out of this, the actual conflicts. I think we get a little bit more of this in, I'm suspecting the other thing you're going to talk about from Book of Secrets, which is the disciplinary section. They do address one of the reasons for discipline is someone within the Disparate Alliance attacks a protectorate of a different group. I think in that respect, this was all kind of a stroke of genius. I think it opens up a lot of really great stories. Whether or not the specific groups make sense, I could quibble here and there about, I think thematically this or that might be better or different, but I think a lot of that comes down to personal thematic preference. I think they broadly do make sense.
And it's one of those things where you can see that they veer away from, with the exception of the Ngoma to me, very large or very powerful groups. You have no one that's like Christians or Islam or Han Chinese, because you'd be like, that's a choice. I don't know if you need a craft.
Well, and it's interesting because they actually address that in the disciplinary section where they talk about, what justifies bringing a mage forward for discipline and attacking one of these groups. They call out that the Sisters of Hippolyta, when the alliance was forming, tried to claim all women as their protectorate, and the rest of the Disparates went, no, I don't think so. That's not happening.
There'd also be, I think, some logistical considerations.
Yes.
With that. But also to me, once you have these protectorates, it also gives you an idea that, yeah, there's 50 of them, but they're probably very potent in this area. Like, to me, looking over this, the Templars are probably quite the force in the Holy Land in a way which I never really thought about them before. My North America ocentrism probably had them as being part of charismatic faith communities hunting vampires in the Midwest, when maybe they should actually be dealing with the Ashira or something like that, which is a Islamic vampire organization. That's a game I kind of want some information on, but also at the same time would be terrified to get information on.
Yeah, I also think it does a good job of revealing some of the little biases we had about them. Like you brought up, the Templar, hunting vampires in the Midwest, except the Templar are really, really, really Catholic. The choristers might spread across all monotheism, but the Templar are Catholic. And Catholicism's not that huge in America. It's here. It's a denomination, but it's not like Latin America. It's not like Italy. And so you suddenly see where they have presence, and those things like fall in place in your head, and you realize, wait, I was thinking about this thing, but actually, no, this makes way more sense. And so I like some of what that reveals about the group.
Then, as you mentioned, that we get the idea that they have the system of adjudication, where at their foundation, each group nominated a number of wise hearts to adjudicate disputes. They get together as a group, depending on what it is. People do not necessarily get to, and this pops up when it occurs between groups. You would not call in the Disparate Alliance to adjudicate a problem between Hippolytans, which is just my adjectival term for the Sisters of Hippolyta. Or the Toftani wouldn't call it in. I think the Toftani would be too proud anyway to call in someone else, unless they're like, this is going to be a banger of a rock show. Let's say that we're having a dispute so everyone can see my wicked effects pedal or something like that. That you have the wise hearts that adjudicate cases, and the executor generals or the swords that are the agents of their decision. And it specifically mentions that this is not something that is universally revered. People recognize that it is a role, but they're not necessarily happy with it. And then we get kind of the list of crimes and so on. Corruption, sexual violence, betrayal. Again, this is only against fellow allies. An ally, capital A, is the term used to discuss people who are part of the Disparate Alliance. Deception, violation of a protectorate, robbery, or murder. And the punishments we get are kind of big. They start out with you give up 2/3 of your material wealth, which is going to be interesting in certain cases. Like, for instance, for me, I view a Templar as being poor, but the Templars as being quite wealthy. So you're like, oh, he took a vow of poverty. Yeah, I guess you can have 2/3 of his bed sheet, because that's and some of his ammunition, because that's most of his personal possessions. And likewise, I don't know about you, but someone telling the Bata'a to give me up 2/3 of your stuff to some white chick, that seems like it wouldn't work too well. Just going off of a historical example. But hey, that's what we have. And you needed to start somewhere. And then it kind of goes from there, where you may just beat the snot out of someone, or you may kill them. What did you think about the law and justice section?
I liked a lot about the law and justice section, but I wish it had 2 more dev passes for some of the reasons you bring up. I felt like the whole you give up 2/3 of what you own as the entry level. One of the things that could prompt this whole system to go into place was theft against an ally. And I'm like, okay, but there's no discussion about what level of theft. Oh no, I lifted your wallet. Maybe I didn't even notice you were a disparate, but I'm surviving on the street, and I pickpocketed a very powerful Wulung. Am I going to end up in front of, a council? What is this going to look like? And now I'm giving up 2/3 of what I own to this Wulung. I mean, just having that as the entry level was very weird to me. And bringing up the Templar, I wrote the Templar section in Rich Bastards, and when I was going through the Disparates, I very much wanted to create a bunch of different economic dynamics. So whereas you have the Wulung who are obsessed with gold and obsessed with wealth, and personal property is very much a real thing, you also have a couple of these communal organizations that are the Templar don't have personal property. I mean, maybe they have a few little things that are theirs, but they don't have meaningful personal wealth, but they have enormous communal wealth. You can get the gear to get the job done. None of it belongs to you. And between missions, it maybe goes to somebody else. Even without that having been explicitly written in Rich Bastards, it's kind of baked into the way some of these groups were written before, and it wasn't unwritten in their write-ups. I liked the emphasis on alliance. I liked we don't really have authority over each other. We don't want to create a hierarchical system. We're not the Tradition Council. And we acknowledge that the Nefandi can infiltrate and corrupt any systems we create anyway. So let's not do that. But we need to hold each other accountable that we're all honoring this alliance. I liked all of that stuff. I like the structure of how the person who's ultimately in charge of a given proceeding can't be from either of the groups that are directly wronged or having, been accused. And I thought all of that was really interesting. I could imagine using it. I could imagine one of those proceedings happening, having a PC accidentally trigger all of this. So in that respect, I really liked it. I just think it needed like 2 more passes for sensibility.
Yeah, and it does bring up the question of like who's going to trigger it. We don't get a notion of like what is the personal cost for getting this justice system up and running in the same way that like to me it is the Mage Society equivalent of you were an offender bender. Maybe you don't tell your insurance company if it's only a couple $100. It's way easier not to get that involved. People complaining like he started it seems like a real good way to have the Disparate Alliance go down in acrimony. But this kind of reaches the end of the information that we get about the Disparates. Lore of the Traditions will have some information talking about tradition and craft diplomacy, possibly, but that's kind of just a maybe. So the question is, how the dink is this organized? And to me, we have a whole bunch of different models. One is, this is like the council. There is a horizon realm out there that the Disparates have. Any number of their groups probably have access to maybe 1 or 2 horizon realms of some sort. We even got a bunch of hollower ones in previous editions. I do kind of like the idea that the Disparates get together at like the Way Down in San Francisco or the Sepulchre or something like that. And people are like, oh man, I love your headdress. And they're just like, please never talk to me again. We get the idea that it could be a step down from that, where maybe if the Traditions is a NATO, where it is a shared military force, this could be more like a UN, where it's mostly talk shop. What do you think of those comparatively centralized ways of organizing?
Well, I think the way it's written, it couldn't possibly be either of those things yet. I think the question that everybody would need to kind of answer at their own table is, where are they headed? Because they haven't been around long enough, and all of the adjudication section in Book of Secrets makes it very clear that they like don't really have much. They know they need some sort of disciplinary structure. So this has all been invented in the past few years. I mean, they're in early days of organization. But if one thing is true about organization, it's that it accretes. Organization begets organization. So I think my thought on it in world from a story standpoint is right now they're probably kind of at that sort of ideal anarchist state of this is all egalitarian. We only exercise authority when we absolutely have to, and only when we are wrong from within. And that's kind of idealistic. And it's not going to stay that way forever, because that's not how humans do. And I like that as a moment in time for a game edition, because I wouldn't want them to be like a council like the Traditions, only because that exists as a play option. Like we've got that political dynamic. I'd like to have something else. I like the idea of them moving towards NATO, even because then if you wanted to run a game in 20, 30 years and have them have progressed further along, that still gives you a different dynamic. That gives you centralized government or strong alliance. Yeah.
Or we modify the history slightly and we say that the technocratic purge at the end of the 20th century is what catalyzed the creation of the Disparate Alliance, or something like that.
Yeah.
We can just kind of monkey with the history a little bit. What does that NATO organization look like to you? Is it one of those things where like the Templars provide the guns? What does that look like to you?
I think it would be less focused than NATO. I mean, NATO is a very focused defense organization. You spend 2% of your GDP on defense. All of our like guns take everybody else's ammo, everything's compatible. In Mage's disparate paradigms, I think, you would have a much less focused effect than that. But using it as kind of a rough model, I think what we'd start to see emerge from that is little sub-organizations. One of the things that I think is missing from M20, it makes sense that it's not there yet. I don't think it would have emerged narratively yet. But again, if we shift the timeline, I think it's useful as a game concept, is we know how technocrats coordinate in an amalgam. We know how tradition mages coordinate in, a given cabal. But disparates, how do they do magic together? ? I mean, they didn't believe any of the like postmodernist mess anyway, as of the end of Revised, end of second edition, and those of them that still existed in Revised. So then now they're cooperating. Did they just suddenly get in on the joke? And like they know everybody's belief system is real? I don't buy that. So what I think would happen is you would start to get groups of them who I think initially would collaborate with the other groups that are closest to their paradigm, and then they might learn how to reach across paradigm. I think you'd get really interesting tensions that would come out of that. I think it would be more about everyone contributing and everyone finding ways to collaborate. I think it would be, all right, these 3 or 4 disparates who all have dominion, say in the Middle East. Maybe you get a really, really unlikely bedfellow situation where the Templar and the Taftani and the Batini have to deal with a sudden emergent fallen threat in the Middle East. And they're there and they're the ones that have power and they get it done. And I think you'd start to have moments like that, and an organization would emerge from that that would be more collaborative. I think even in its sort of evolved state, its more developed state, you'd have something more distributed than the traditions. I both think that's what makes sense in the story, and I also want that just to have different options in the game.
You brought up some of my thoughts. One is it is a mutual aid network, and there just aren't mixed groups. There isn't necessarily a single group where a bunch of sisters, a bunch of Templars, and a bunch of Taftani are actually working elbow to elbow. It's more or less that the sisters know, hey, we need more firepower to take down this child trafficking ring than we have. I know a guy. And that could be something where it is point to point, or there is some sort of centralized thing that does have caches of quintessence or material or a network of favors located around the world. And it could be more that it is a collection of boons and debts that are possibly enforced with guiche or promises or mental compulsions, or it is a way of maintaining status in a messy world. The other one that came to mind to me is there are mixed, disparate groups. They're just exceedingly rare, maybe to the point where the modern age of magic kicked off with the March of the Nine, which ended in a shit show. We could have a second Nine, not realizing, either very knowingly or very not knowingly, recapitulating that, but this time it works. This time the threat is so bogged down that they don't have time to disagree with everything, and they have some spectacular success. And that acts as a rallying cry that we accidentally have this disparate Justice League that somehow pulled off something ridiculous. They destroy a call. Or they prevent the rise of Mulhectorus. And maybe the Disparates essentially just has 1 or 2 groups that are really the connecting nodes. And that is the tension, that your group is one of the only disparate groups that has figured it out. And you carry so much weight in how to get the group to get along. Another one is this hasn't actually happened yet. This is all theoretical, and everyone is still kind of figuring it out. The last through line I kind of had was there are some unifying themes among the disparates that could kind of make it work. It's not quite in on the joke, but it's a level closer. You have a bunch of religious groups with religion as an organizing idea. Maybe they can kind of get together in some way, shape, or form where, yeah, we are the doctrinal Catholics, but you believe you're part of the celestial hierarchy, which is headed by the august personage of Jade. Maybe we can bend our doctrine enough for space for that. It may not be that the polytheists and the monotheists can necessarily work side by side, but there's just enough that through a set of one-to-one associations that maybe the Yazidi and the Wulong can work together in some way or something like that. Or the Hippolyta and the Zoroastrian groups are like this, we can make this particular thing work. Or the industrial, financial, and business groups, you have the Nagoma, who maybe they can work with the Wulong. They both recognize the power of high ritual magic or something like that. Or maybe they work really hard to have it not come up in the same way that people are like, how to argue with your relatives about politics over Thanksgiving. You're like, maybe or not, or maybe not. Let's just do the not option. Now, in a game, it would be very hard to do that on a recurring basis if you had a mixed group, but it could partially explain how it could work out in the world. And maybe they did get in on the joke because they are, to some extent, all marginalized. I don't I don't have a good answer to that question. I wish there were one, but that to me, as you bring it up, just really feels like something that feels like a circle we really can't square without going postmodern for every group in the damn game. And and when that happens, you're just like, yeah, I really feel like we lose something.
Yeah, and I don't want to go postmodern with every group in the game. I would like there to be maybe some adventures, some stories, maybe some space in the upcoming Disparate book. I wouldn't expect it knowing how the books are formatted, but I would love this. If they gave some of those examples of like, okay, some Wulung and some of the Alibatin and some of the Knights Templar got together and they were able to find the commonality in their belief. They did not go postmodern. They went, this we all believe in. We can make magic around this. And maybe it's a smaller sphere than any of us can do individually, but we can just like punch it. And I would like to see some examples of collaboration that don't rely on everyone kind of gets the joke. I don't want everyone to get the joke.
And I think it could be one of those things where your craft and your work with the Disparate Alliance are in tension with one another. That a brother in the Knights Templar cannot be both a doctrinal Templar and a doctrinal member of the Disparates. And that is kind of causing a cleave within each of these groups. There are more open to other magical practitioners, Kopaloe, but they are viewed askance by everyone else. In the same way that in Vampire, your coterie may consist entirely of vampires that are kind of on the outs with the rest of their clan. Because what are you doing running with this Bruja Toreador artist? So it could be one of those trade-offs that for the Disparates to work, it kind of depends on a group of outcasts who find more in common with each other than they have with their own affiliates. And then how does that work with the idea that there is a mortal community that they are trying to protect? And the answer I have to that is, I don't know. There's a few other weird options. Like it could literally be a conflux. Their avatars make it work. So we have two groups in Mage that have that happen. Marauders and the Disparates. Or it could just be a case of it's a generation of kids. To me, there could be the Techno Disparates or the Shamanic Disparates, which I don't think could include every Disparate Alliance group. But we do get the idea, or at least when I say we get the idea, a thing I shoved forward in the Celestial Chorus and Virtual Adepts in the Lore of the Traditions is everyone has a shamanic group, everyone has a punk group, everyone has a technomantic group of some sort. And to me, if your Disparate Alliance group is large enough, that would apply there too. And maybe that's the thing that functions across lines. But one of the defining features of being part of the traditions is you're all part of the Council of the Nine. We have no indication that every member of every craft in the Disparate Alliance supports the Disparate Alliance. So it could just be AAA. Some people have the membership card, other people don't bother.
The other thing I would love to see is now that this group exists, how do new organizations join? Because it's not every single craft. I mean, that's pretty clear. And, this might just be me living in 2022. And I know not everyone wants to bring real world politics in, but I look at real world politics and I'm like, oh, this is an example that could make some interesting story. When I look at the whole mess that's happening right now with like Finland and Sweden joining NATO and the way Erdogan is getting in and pushing around on that, and maybe I don't want to let them in. And then I look at the Disparates and I'm like, that's totally a story that would happen eventually if they existed long enough. What happens if someone leaves? What happens if, the Knights Templar just goes, I can't do this anymore. We need to care about this one thing, and they run off because they're too hierarchical for all of this, or the Wulung, or maybe on the other end, one of the more horizontal, less organized groups is just sick of being accountable, even though the accountability is less than the council or whatever. And I think those would be really, really interesting stories, especially if you are, one of the little guys in those groups that are either trying to join or are being kicked out. Mm-hmm. And maybe you don't agree with your leaders. Also, what do leaders mean?
Yeah.
In the crafts, because it is not a single answer the way it is for the traditions. In the same way that when the original council happened, everyone like picked a representative, but those representatives did not lead their entire groups. Mm-hmm. They do now, because like that organization has self-reinforced itself, but that's not true of the Disparates yet. So There's some really fun, messy, intrigue games that you could make out of that sort of transformation in the Disparates.
Yeah, and in M20 we get a list of groups that may join the Balamob, the group of Mayan Jaguar priests, the Thunder Society, mystics from North American native nations that don't like the Dream Speakers. I want information on that. That could be anything from legitimate complaints to someone is just being an absolute queen about things. Both of those are absolutely acceptable to me. The Uzoma, which are Yoruban intercessors inspired by the Bata'a. Navalon, the idealistic breakaway technocrats. That's one of those ones where it's like, you didn't think the Sisters and the Templars got along. Hold my beer. Here's a bunch of British people saying they're going to save the world. What could possibly go wrong? Mirahoi no Men, Japanese techno-mystic tricksters with psychic powers. The Red Thorn Dedicants, Lilithian mages who kind of make the Verbena and the Cult of Ecstasy look tame. The Itza'at, I love this line, a long-hidden sect of Mayan time-seers who's mysteriously escaped notice for over 500 years. Boy, howdy, is that a way to just jam someone into the continuity. And the Go Kamisori Gama, a clan of hypertech ninjas who have their own reasons for wanting to topple the technocracy. And I like your idea that the membership of the Disparate Alliance is constantly changing. It has a certain degree of turnover. Some people are exposed to other practices, which generates new things. And then you may have the schism between it being like, well, they left. Does that mean that I still have to observe their protectorate? No. Like, if it really does result in the protection of your mortal people, maybe you are willing to compromise more to a degree than anything that we've had before. I also wouldn't be surprised if people weren't familiar to the full extent of the organization's own membership. In the same way that before Facebook, there were a lot of relatives I had that I didn't know were monster political asshats. So, to quote Chris Hayes, a little bit of repression is actually pretty useful to have a community run. So I would be curious if that were a direction that the organization could go. Besides that, do you think the Disparates as listed, the Disparate Alliance is ultimately playable? And if a table wants to do that, what do you kind of think they have to figure out first, either about the organization or about how this weird intergroup magic works?
I definitely think it's playable. And I think in terms of what needs to be figured out, that really rests, unfortunately, on the shoulders of the storyteller. Because unless you've got a bunch of hardcore, mage lore fanatics at your table, truth be told, most of what's going on in the fine grain detail of the game, you can kind of munge and it's okay. I think in terms of the how to do magic collaboratively, if you're working with experienced mage players, I think the best way to describe it is to kind of talk in terms of those extreme situations when the technocracy coordinates with the traditions. And this is a thing in canon. It's very rare, but if there's a huge nefandous threat or a major problem, even in the contemporary setting, there are threats that are extreme enough that the traditions and the technocrats will collaborate. Say, if you're thinking about this and you have a lot of experience, how am I going to make my paradigm fit? Just be like, well, do some thought experiments. What was it like when the virtual adepts first joined the traditions? Because they had to solve a problem that's a lot harder than what you're tackling right now. So think through that. And how can I justify this? And let your characters justify it narratively. My rule in Mage is if you describe something narratively and it would fly in a medium budget TV series on this concept, then I'm going to make it cool in game and I'm going to let you do it. Like, it does not need to be a perfect paradigmatic match. It needs to have verisimilitude and the people at the table need to think it's cool. And so I think if you approach it that way, even though there isn't like an explicit explanation of how it works, I think those are ways to think about it that make it possible to tackle. I think ideally, though, you do have a storyteller that in the moment when two players go, we want to collaborate and here's what we want to do, but we don't know quite how to do it. Honestly, as a storyteller, I will get in and make suggestions. I am not here to get in the way of that. I will help you construct the story, and that's fine, and that works, and it adds a lot of fun at the table. So I think it just calls for a very collaborative storyteller.
And to me, it's a process of you don't need a single universal answer. You need an answer for this group of mages. You need an answer for each kind of interface. And to me, it's perfectly fine to have doctrinaire or doctrinal members of a craft who just refuse to participate in it. And part of the fun could be getting that person on board or working around their concerns. Yeah, we don't need a universal answer. I look forward to seeing what we get in the book on the Disparates. And once that gets close to being out, I look forward to going on autopilot for a month as I just have a succession of interviews with the authors as I go, tell me about group. And I'm excited to hopefully go on autopilot for 2 or 3 months while that's going through after the Terry having to cobble together episodes, because M20 books are massive and Adam and I can only cover one per month. So we've talked about the structure of the technocracy. We've talked about the structure of the Disparates. We talked about anarcho-syndicalism and why that should be in your game. We talked about technomatic crafts. Of the 10,000 thoughts you have that you would like to see explored in Mage, what is the next one where you would be like, you know what? I think there's interesting ideas that we could talk about for roughly 50 to 80 minutes.
Oh, I would really love to talk about what Mage has to say about the other games. Like, I know that you've done episodes about crossover in general, but I'm really interested in what Mage actually has to say about the other games. I ran into this when reading for this episode. The original write-up on the Kopaloe just devoted an enormous amount of time talking about the Menehune, which is this like weird fringe part of Changeling that made it into M20, but I don't know anyone who's used it. I spent a year trying to find someone to come on to Walking Away from Arcadia and talk about the Menehune, and I could not. I couldn't find anybody. And there's all this word count, and I know that there's kind of some similar crossover with Werewolf. Certainly the whole like syndicate vampire thing, while there's not a lot of word count, it's a thing that exists. And yeah, I'd love to like munch all that together and be like, is there a thing here? Is there a way of like playing this? Because I think there's something there that's never been totally given a shape.
And if there's anyone who's able to pull something out of the vague recesses of a game and be like, I have critical thoughts on it, that person is Victor Kinzer of Walking Away from Arcadia and Soulbound and any number of other ventures. Victor, once again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's always a blast.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where we totally let you join our Disparate Alliance, assuming your craft were valorous, driven, and willing to chip in occasionally for pizza. Our executive producers are Joshua Hillerup, Oracle, who believes Sobek was right; Buck Farmer, Oracle of having British technocrats LARPing as knights and thinking it's a good idea; Christopher Phillips, Oracle of making adherents of the Path of Lilith go, they're a bit too much; Mikhail, Oracle of wanting Mayan Jaguar priests; Jay Widener, Oracle of Japanese hypertech ninjas, and ninjas in general. Can we just get more ninjas in this game? And finally, Crew of Erebus, Oracle of having more shamanic crafts because shoving all of them into 1 or 2 groups is super lame. Thank you for your support. Additionally, I'd like to thank Alex, Alexia, Anders S., Andrew Edelstein, Anon, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Bedurfy, Boo, Boogers to the Sixth, Brad the Blue, Bryce Perry, Chris B., Daniel Cuppen, Daniel Scribner, Dan Svensson, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Derek Semsek, Gargle Noir, George Laura, Guy Conan Stewart, Ia Bull, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Briggs, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., John Magnuson, Joshua Heath, Kathleen Halperin, Leslie Weatherstone, Matthew Proyle, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Morgan Aran, Nathan Weaver, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klamenov, Oliver Schindler, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Puka G, Rachel Grace, Ralph Scheinhammer, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, Thrice Great, William Connolly, William Martin, and Zach Rules. Our EP shout-out is to Chris B., who has a letter in their name, and when I think letters, I think Morse code, so today's thank you is in Morse code. Here it is. I think it said, thank you for the support, but I don't actually natively speak Morse code. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast@gmail.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We have a Hop Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. If you like us, please give us the review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Everything helps. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.